So the question here is, draw the state transition diagram for the logic circuit shown below, and this is the circuit shown here. And this question they had asked for engineering services mains exam for electronic and telecommunication branch from the subject of digital for 10 marks. So in this question we have to find out the state transition diagram, and in this circuit the D flip-flop is cascaded with this mux. So here we can assume this D flip-flop output initially. If we are assuming this Q as a 0, then this Q bar will be 1. If we are assuming this Q as a 1, then this Q bar will be 0. And now as per the input A, this D flip-flop output will change their state. So if I am assuming that initially Q is 0, then by that time this input A might be 0 or it might be 1. So if I am assuming that this A input is 0 here, if A input is 0 here, by that time this is going to select the line as a X0 which is having the input 1. So this input 1 will pass through this output of this mux, and that is going to change this output of the D flip-flop. So initially it was 0, now it will transit to 1. So here if this control signals as a is equal to 0, then this Q output will force it to 1. If this A is 1 here, in this case itself, if I am assuming that Q is 0 and if A is given here as a 1, so if A is 1 means it is going to select this X1 line, and here initially we had assumed the output is 0, so this 0 is passing to this D input. It means it is not going to change their state. So by that time this will be in the Q state itself. So if this A is 1, by that time there is no state change when we are assuming that Q is 0. And if we are assuming that Q is 0, by that time if A input is 0, it will transit from Q is equal to 0 to Q is equal to 1. Now if we are assuming that this Q output is 1, then how the transition will take place we need to understand here. If Q is 1 here and if A is keeping here as a 0, what will happen? If A is 0, it means it is going to select this X0 line, and when Q we are assuming that as a 1, it means it is forcing this to go to 0, so that state transition will take place from Q is equal to 1 to Q is equal to 0. So here if this A is 0 and Q is at 1, it means if A is 0, it is going to select which line? This X0 line which is having the input of 0. So this 0 will pass through this line to this D flip-flop here, and this will force it to go from 1 to 0. So that is the reason this transition will take place here. As like Q is equal to 1, it will force to 0 if A is equal to 0. Now if we are assuming that Q is 1 here and if A input is 1, what will happen? If A input is 1, it means this mux is going to be selecting the line as a X1 which is having the input as a 1. It means this 1 is going to pass through this D input, so that D will produce 1 itself. It means it is already in this state 1, so that it will be retaining the same state. So by that time this can be shown by this way. So if A is 1, it means there is no change in this state, and by this way this state transition diagram can be drawn corresponding to this figure. And the same question they had asked in GATE 2012. So that is the reason I am suggesting to the students, before appearing in this engineering services exam, you must have to go through that previous year question of GATE for EC, for electrical instrumentation, so that you will be having good practice of the questions and you can easily answer this type of questions in the ESE exam without lapsing your time. So this is the transition diagram for this question.